Welcome the anointed ones. People don't panic when nothing changes. They panic when change happens too fast for their explanations to keep up. Here's the part nobody likes to admit out loud. When someone goes from zero to unstoppable in a suspiciously short amount of time, the room doesn't applaud first. It freezes. Then it whispers. Because rapid improvement doesn't just impress people, it accuses them. It forces everyone watching to confront a very uncomfortable truth. Growth is not as rare as they've been pretending, it's just inconvenient. There's an actual psychological fact behind this. Studies on attribution bias show that when people witness an unexpected leap in performance, they instinctively assign the cause to an external influence rather than internal effort. Why? Because believing someone did it alone makes the gap feel reachable, and that's terrifying. If discipline, clarity, or self-alignment can trigger an overhaul that fast, then the real question becomes, why haven't I done it? So the mind reaches for a safer explanation. A puppeteer, a hidden hand, a person behind the scenes. That's where you come in. Not because you engineered anything, but because you happened to exist near the moment the switch flipped. You became the mental bookmark between who they were and who they suddenly became. To observers, your presence feels too coincidental to ignore, so they rewrite the story until it feels comfortable. Credit gets reassigned, responsibility gets redistributed, and suddenly, you're not just a bystander. You're the unofficial architect of someone else's glow-up. There's also a quiet layer of humor in all this if you step back far enough. People will ignore years of effort, private discipline, and internal chaos, but confidently conclude, yeah, it was probably that one person they were around. Human logic is fascinating like that, deeply sophisticated when it wants to be, and impressively lazy when accountability shows up uninvited. So no, this isn't really about a player leveling up fast. It's about how people react when their mental math stops working, when timelines collapse, when progress refuses to move at the polite, socially acceptable pace everyone else agreed on. And once that happens, someone has to carry the explanation. Whether you asked for it or not, they decided that someone is you. Number 1. Your presence disrupted their baseline, and people confuse disruption with control. Most people don't realize how fragile normal really is. Normal is just a shared agreement to move at the same speed, expect the same outcomes, and stay comfortably predictable. So when someone suddenly accelerates mentally, emotionally, financially, creatively, it doesn't register as progress first. It registers as a disturbance. Something broke the rhythm. Something shifted the balance. And whenever a system is disrupted, the human instinct isn't to understand it, but to locate who caused it. That's where you come in. You didn't push, plan, or program anything. You didn't sit anyone down with a blueprint for transformation. You simply existed differently in the same space. Different pace, different tolerance for nonsense, different way of responding to pressure. That difference alone is enough to destabilize a stagnant environment. People don't notice stillness until motion enters the room. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When a person improves rapidly, observers don't want to believe the change came from internal decisions. That would mean the same option has always been available to them. So instead, they look for a controller, someone who triggered it. Influence feels less threatening than accountability. Control feels safer than choice. The moment you were present before the overhaul, your presence became the explanation. Not because it's accurate, but because it's convenient. You became the story that protects everyone else from asking harder questions about effort, discipline, and delayed courage. It's easier to say you disrupted the baseline than admit the baseline was weak to begin with. What people miss is that disruption doesn't require authority. It doesn't require intention. It only requires contrast. When someone sees another way of being, calmer under pressure, sharper in decision-making, more deliberate with time, it creates friction. That friction wakes something up. And once awakened, movement happens fast. So when the jump looks dramatic, people mistake the disruption for control. They confuse the spark with the engine. They see the timing and assume orchestration. In reality, all you did was expose how low the bar had been set. And once that bar moved, everything else had no choice but to follow. Number 2, you didn't coach them. You mirrored what they were avoiding. Change rarely comes from instructions or advice. People love to think a nudge, a speech, or a pep talk is enough to ignite transformation, but real overhauls are quieter and much more ruthless. What actually triggers someone to level up is confrontation, not of them, but of themselves. And you became that confrontation without even trying. You weren't giving them a plan, you weren't pointing out flaws, you weren't setting deadlines. You were simply showing, through your presence, what they were avoiding facing in themselves. Humans are masters of distraction. They will busy themselves with strategy, excuses, or comparisons to avoid that uncomfortable mirror. But when someone comes along who refuses to fit into the same excuses, refuses to bend to the inertia, it exposes the gaps everyone else is running from. Your life, your choices, your energy, your standards, they reflected what they feared acknowledging, and that reflection is far more powerful than 1,000 pep talks. It forces action, and action is the mother of transformation. Observers see the outcome and assume you actively pulled strings. They say you coached them, pushed them, or somehow masterminded the change. They give you the credit because it's easier to externalize growth than admit the person inside finally got honest with themselves. But the truth is, you were a mirror. You created no plan. You didn't strategize. You just existed authentically, and that existence shined a light on what the player had been avoiding. The parts of themselves they were too scared, lazy, or stubborn to fix. This is why disruption looks like influence. The leap in progress appears deliberate, coordinated, intentional. But what happened is far subtler and far more powerful. You were the contrast, the natural tension that makes them uncomfortable enough to act. And once they acted, once they faced the internal gap, momentum became inevitable. You didn't engineer it, you revealed it, and people misread revelation as manipulation. That's the brutal truth of growth. Sometimes your mere alignment with integrity and clarity is all it takes to make someone confront the work they've been avoiding, and it terrifies everyone who thought they were still in control. Number 3. People assume proximity equals influence because they underestimate self-responsibility. When someone makes a sudden leap, the first instinct of onlookers is to find an external reason. Human brains crave explanations that don't require self-reflection. If someone else is behind it, the world feels fairer, safer, and more predictable. That's why your proximity to this player instantly became the cause in everyone's eyes. They saw you, they saw the change, and their minds stitched the two together. It's a simple shortcut, a mental cheat code that spares them from confronting the uncomfortable truth. Real growth comes from within, not from someone else's presence. People love to give influence to the visible figure because it removes responsibility from themselves. They ignore the countless hours of private effort, the self-discipline, the failures, the self-inflicted pressure that actually built the transformation. Those pieces are invisible, inconvenient, and, frankly, exhausting to acknowledge. So the narrative shifts. You become the reason they improved, the catalyst they couldn't have done it without. Observers feel safer telling that story because it lets them keep believing their own lack of progress is someone else's fault, or someone else's fault for failing to help them. Proximity feels like power, but it's an illusion. You could have walked past and done nothing, and the player may have still leveled up, but the timing of your presence makes you the easy explanation. Human minds crave causality, and when it comes to success, it's far easier to attribute it externally than to internal effort. That's why people misread correlation as causation and assign agency where there was none. The truth is, you didn't make anyone grow. You didn't hand them skills, force motivation, or dictate their path. You simply existed near a person ready to take action. Your proximity highlighted the potential they were ignoring. And for anyone watching from the sidelines, it was easier to say you were in control than admit that the player owned their own transformation. That misperception is powerful because it elevates you in the story without you touching the engine of change. People will always underestimate self-responsibility because it's inconvenient to admit that growth is messy, painful, and entirely internal. Number 4. The overhaul threatens observers, so they need a story that minimizes it. When someone explodes from zero to unstoppable, it does more than impress people. It makes them uncomfortable. It threatens their assumptions, shakes the foundation of what they thought was predictable, and exposes the reality they've been avoiding. That transformation is possible for anyone willing to do the work. That threat is subtle but powerful. People don't confront it directly because that would force them to question their own choices, routines, and excuses. Instead, they build a story that minimizes the achievement, and the easiest target to blame or credit is the person closest to the change. You. The mind loves narratives that reduce uncertainty. A sudden rise makes the world feel chaotic. People crave order, and the human brain resolves chaos by assigning agency. If they can say, "Oh, it wasn't them, it was that person influencing them," then the gap suddenly makes sense. The threat vanishes. The transformation is no longer a challenge to their assumptions about effort, discipline, and timing. It becomes an external event, something manipulated from outside. You become the invisible hand, the mastermind they can point to, rather than the inconvenient reminder that growth is messy, personal, and unstoppable when the right choices are made. What's fascinating is how often this happens without any malicious intent. People don't lie to harm you. They lie to stabilize their own reality. The faster and cleaner the transformation appears, the harder it is for observers to accept that it came from within the player. Humans are wired to simplify. Complexity is uncomfortable, so you, by mere presence, become the narrative shortcut. You are the explanation that allows everyone else to breathe again. Meanwhile, the player quietly steps into a new reality, while everyone else debates who made it happen. That's the irony. The real work was done in silence by the person changing. But perception doesn't reward effort, it rewards visibility. You didn't orchestrate it, but your proximity made it believable to the outside world that you did. That perception is powerful because it gives you influence without effort, simply by being a witness to transformation that the world isn't ready to understand. Number 5. You became the symbolic before and after marker in their timeline. People don't notice slow change. They barely register it when someone improves gradually over months or years. But when a person shifts dramatically in a short period, human brains instinctively search for a reference point. We need context to process transformation, and that's where you slip into the story. You didn't do the work, you didn't hand out instructions, and you didn't manipulate outcomes, but your presence created a natural bookmark. There's a clear before you and after you, and the mind seizes on that because it's easier to digest than acknowledging the messy, invisible grind that actually caused the shift. The reality is that the player's journey was internal, private, and entirely their own. Late nights, mental battles, missed attempts, and countless small decisions built the foundation for the leap. Nobody sees that. Human brains are lazy when it comes to credit. It's far simpler to attach a visible figure to the narrative than to recognize that transformation is often lonely and unglamorous. That's why your existence near the right moment becomes a mental shortcut. You're the punctuation in their story, the and then, that allows observers to connect the dots without doing the uncomfortable work of understanding effort, strategy, and internal courage. Once people latch onto this symbolic role, perception amplifies it. Every improvement, every confident step, every visible success is subconsciously attributed to your influence. They might talk about your presence, your standards, or the energy you bring, but the real engine of change is invisible. They don't see the countless small choices the player made because they can't handle the truth. Growth is personal, relentless, and unmediated. This symbolic placement is powerful because it gives you unearned credit without you taking a single action. The player's evolution is real, but the story belongs in part to you in the minds of everyone else. You didn't shape the outcome. You didn't push the pieces into place. You simply existed at the pivot point, and human perception, desperate for a neat explanation, rewrote the narrative to make you the marker between what was and what became. It's subtle, it's psychological, and it's more influence than most people ever earn intentionally. Number 6, your standards quietly reset the room without you saying a word. Influence doesn't always come from speeches, commands, or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from the quiet insistence of presence. People feel it immediately when someone operates on a higher level of clarity, discipline, or integrity than the environment has grown accustomed to. You didn't announce rules or hand out instructions, you just lived according to your own standards, and that alone is enough to shift the energy around you, to subtly raise the baseline of what's considered acceptable. Humans are incredibly sensitive to contrast. When someone suddenly embodies a level of focus, poise, or decisiveness that everyone else has been avoiding, it exposes the gaps in others. It's uncomfortable. It creates tension. People start comparing their own behaviors, choices, and routines without even realizing it. That tension is what accelerates change. It doesn't matter whether you intended to influence anyone. The sheer clarity of your presence forces people to adjust. And when someone in that room decides to act, to rise to meet the new energy, it looks from the outside like you made it happen, when in reality, you simply reset the floor without lifting a finger. What's fascinating is how invisible this process is. Nobody sees the moment they measure themselves against you. They only notice the results: sharper decisions, quicker action, newfound confidence, or the sudden alignment of priorities. They credit you because human brains need a story to explain sudden jumps. They assume influence was exerted, when in truth, the power was in your consistency, your uncompromising standards, and the silent example you set. Being the standard bearer doesn't require force, it doesn't require pressure, it just requires refusing to lower yourself to match mediocrity. Your energy becomes a quiet benchmark, a gravitational pull that subtly demands adaptation. Once someone rises to meet it, the transformation appears dramatic. Everyone else assumes orchestration. They see only the effect, not the invisible influence of example. And that's why your mere presence can reset a room, quietly, relentlessly, and without ever speaking a single word. Number 7. Observers mistake emotional friction for strategic manipulation. Change is rarely neat. It's messy, uncomfortable, and full of tension. When someone around you suddenly accelerates in life, people watch the process unfold and try to make sense of it. And because humans hate ambiguity, they look for a cause, a visible force that could explain the disruption. That's when your presence gets misread. Any friction, any tension, any challenge that naturally arises is seen as a deliberate move on your part, as if you orchestrated the entire transformation like a chess master. In reality, nothing could be further from the truth. Emotional friction is just the byproduct of contrast. When someone embodies clarity, focus, or authenticity that others in the environment lack, it creates a subtle unease. It's not a push, it's a mirror. People feel it because they can't escape noticing their own gaps. And when the person growing experiences that tension internally, it sparks movement. They confront themselves, confront their limits, confront the work they've been avoiding. That friction is entirely natural. It's not manufactured. It's simply the energy that emerges when someone refuses to settle for mediocrity around others who are still comfortable. Observers, however, love a good story. They see the tension, they see you in the room, and they immediately connect the dots incorrectly. They say, "Oh, they're being pushed, guided, manipulated." They assign intent where none exists because human brains crave causality. It's easier to believe someone controlled the situation than accept that a person could awaken their own potential, challenge themselves, and rise without interference. The irony is that your role in the narrative is entirely accidental. You didn't plan the discomfort, you didn't leverage it. You simply existed as a reference point, a standard, a presence that highlighted the gaps no one else wanted to face. This is why sudden overhauls always create stories around external forces. Emotional friction is unavoidable, but influence doesn't require orchestration. Your presence naturally triggers tension, tension sparks growth, and observers mistake the reaction for strategy. They credit manipulation, not the simple fact that some people rise when confronted with what they've been avoiding. You didn't push the player forward, you reflected their own untapped potential, and that is far more powerful than any deliberate move could ever be. Number 8. The overhaul forced others to re-evaluate their assumptions, and they resent that. People are deeply attached to their mental maps of the world. They categorize everyone into neat boxes, predictable, limited, controllable. It's comforting, it's simple, it allows them to feel safe while staying in the same place. But when someone around them explodes into a level of growth that defies expectations, those mental maps crumble. Suddenly, everything they thought they understood about the player and about themselves is called into question. That kind of disruption makes people uncomfortable, and discomfort breeds resentment. Your presence in this scenario becomes a catalyst, not because you pushed or coached, but because you happened to exist in the environment during the transformation. Observers start noticing patterns they had ignored before. They notice how long the player struggled in silence, how small daily decisions added up, how consistency quietly reshaped them. And when they notice, they feel threatened, not by the player, but by the implication that they too have been underestimating potential in themselves and others. That realization is heavy, and humans rarely enjoy admitting they miscalculated. Resentment emerges because people are forced to reconcile two conflicting truths. One, they assumed control and understood outcomes, and two, their assumptions were wrong. It's far easier to blame an external influence, you, than to sit with the uncomfortable knowledge that someone's growth was inevitable and deserved, and that they simply weren't paying attention. That blame shifts focus away from self-reflection and onto a visible target, giving observers a false sense of order. What they fail to see is that transformation is never about the people watching. The player's leap was built in silence, through decisions and work no one noticed. Your presence simply highlighted the shift in contrast, showing the gaps that others had conveniently ignored. People resent what forces them to look at reality they'd rather avoid, and your proximity makes it easy to channel that resentment outward. You didn't cause the transformation, but you became the face of the disruption, the symbol everyone needed to rationalize a change they couldn't fully comprehend. That tension, that subtle discomfort, only magnifies the perception of your influence, making you appear more powerful than anyone could plan or control. Number 9. People overestimate influence because they don't see internal wars. Everyone loves a neat story with a visible hand guiding the outcome. When someone rises fast, the outside world assumes there was strategy, pressure, or influence behind it. What they fail to see, and what most people never understand, is the invisible battlefield that actually drives transformation. Growth doesn't happen in public. It happens in the private corners of a person's mind, in the moments when they wrestle with doubt, laziness, fear, and temptation. Those are the battles nobody observes, and because they're invisible, the world attributes the leap to whatever external presence was nearby. You. The truth is, real change is brutal and unspectacular. It's waking up while everyone else sleeps, forcing yourself to show up when no one is watching, staring down failure over and over until you can't ignore progress anymore. Every win the player achieved came from choices made in silence, tiny acts of courage repeated relentlessly. Those moments leave no trace, no applause, no visible signature. So observers instinctively look for a cause they can see. That's where you enter the narrative. You are the convenient explanation for something far messier and far more personal than anyone is prepared to admit. Humans are wired to assign agency externally because it's psychologically easier. They don't want to acknowledge the sheer amount of effort, pain, and self-discipline that actually fuels transformation. It's more comforting to say it was their environment or that person or some hidden influence than to consider that people can take complete ownership of their own leap. That misperception inflates your apparent influence without any action on your part. What makes this especially fascinating is that you didn't even need to touch the process. You simply existed in proximity to someone ready to fight their internal wars, someone capable of stepping into discomfort and refusing to retreat. Your presence becomes the shorthand story that explains what others can't fully understand. And because people don't see the struggle behind the curtain, they overestimate your influence and underestimate the sheer internal effort that made the transformation inevitable. Number 10. You represent possibility, and possibility scares stagnant minds. People fear what they cannot control, and nothing is more unsettling than the clear demonstration that change is possible. When someone around them transforms rapidly, it forces observers to confront a truth they've been quietly avoiding. If growth can happen that fast for someone else, it could happen for them too. That realization is terrifying because it doesn't just challenge their assumptions about others, it challenges their assumptions about themselves. You, by merely existing near that shift, became a symbol of possibility. You didn't instruct, push, or manipulate. You simply embodied a standard, a presence, a way of being that reminded others what's achievable, whether they like it or not. Possibility is uncomfortable because it carries responsibility. If a player can rise dramatically, then the rest of the room must either accept mediocrity or step up to meet it. That choice exposes laziness, fear, indecision, and avoidance in ways people don't want to admit. It's easier to assign your presence as the trigger for transformation than to face the fact that growth is always available, and sometimes quicker than anyone expects. You become the convenient scapegoat or the credited engine, because the alternative forces self-examination, and very few are willing to do that. What's fascinating is that you don't even need to act intentionally. Possibility is contagious simply because it exists in contrast to stagnation. Your standards, focus, or energy create a visible line in the sand. People see it and feel the gap. That gap is uncomfortable. That gap is motivating. And yet it scares them so much they misattribute it to influence rather than to the fact that growth is always possible if someone decides to claim it. The irony is sharp. You are perceived as the cause of something that was already inevitable because of someone else's choices. You're not the force. They are. But your presence makes the leap legible, tangible, and undeniable. Possibility terrifies because it shows people the gap between where they are and what they could be, and they cannot ignore it. That tension alone explains why your existence in that moment becomes bigger in perception than the action itself. You are the living proof of what is possible, and human minds, comfortable in stagnation, fear it more than failure itself. Number 11. Credit and blame share the same psychological root. Humans have an almost reflexive need to explain outcomes, especially sudden or dramatic ones. When someone rises quickly, people immediately search for a cause. The strange part is, the cause can be framed in two completely opposite ways: credit or blame. Both stem from the same psychological instinct, to protect themselves from the uncomfortable truth that success, growth, or transformation often comes from personal responsibility, consistency, and difficult choices. People would rather assign the outcome to an external force than admit the reality. Someone simply decided to rise and refused to settle for mediocrity. That's why your presence becomes central in the story, whether they paint you as the mastermind behind success or the manipulator behind the curtain. The mind prefers stories with clear lines. Success without an explanation feels chaotic and threatening. Blame is comforting because it frames progress as a product of manipulation. Credit is comforting because it frames progress as a product of someone else's genius. Either way, your role is magnified, and observers can avoid the more difficult reflection that the player's leap was fueled by their own choices, discipline, and courage. By giving you agency in the story, they resolve cognitive dissonance without facing the messy reality of personal growth. It's fascinating because you didn't need to influence anything directly. You simply existed as a reference point, a marker of contrast, a presence that allowed their achievements to be contextualized. That contrast is all humans need to craft a story. When people see it, they assign narrative, whether it's they owed it to you or you forced it out of them. Both interpretations feel logical, both give them a sense of order, and both relieve them from the heavier truth, that growth is internal, relentless, and personal. The irony is sharp. You get amplified influence without lifting a finger. Credit and blame are two sides of the same coin, and your proximity automatically puts you in the middle. The player did the work, bore the struggle, and claimed the transformation, but the human brain demands a story. That story always finds you, inflates your presence, and convinces everyone watching that you somehow controlled what, in reality, was already inevitable. That is power without effort, and it's more absolute than most people ever realize. Number 12. The player changed pace, not personality, and that confused everyone. When someone suddenly accelerates in life, people instinctively assume a total transformation, like a personality swap or some radical reinvention. But that's rarely how real change works. True evolution is about pace, focus, and alignment, not a complete rewrite of who someone is at their core. The player didn't become someone entirely new. They simply started moving differently, thinking differently, and acting with intention they hadn't exercised before. That shift in tempo is subtle to the person experiencing it, but to outsiders, it looks like a dramatic overhaul, and humans naturally search for someone to credit or blame for it. That's where your presence gets magnified. The world struggles to understand invisible effort. No one sees the internal recalibration that makes rapid progress possible. They don't see the countless nights spent wrestling with self-doubt, the repeated failures, the slow rewiring of habits, or the discipline quietly stacking results over time. They only see the sudden leap forward, and their minds scramble to find an explanation. The assumption becomes, someone must have caused this. You, by being near the tipping point, get positioned as that someone, even if your role was purely incidental. What really confuses observers is the subtlety of pace versus personality. The player isn't suddenly fearless, charismatic, or inherently superior. They're just operating with more consistency, clarity, and deliberate action. Those traits amplify their natural abilities and make them appear transformed to anyone stuck in the old timeline. Humans, desperate for a tidy story, misinterpret that acceleration as external influence rather than internal alignment finally paying off. Your proximity becomes a narrative shortcut. People unconsciously link your presence to the change because the shift is visible, dramatic, and easily framed. The reality is far more complex. The transformation came from private discipline, choices, and persistence. But the difference between pace and personality is too subtle for the outside world to pass. They see motion, not the internal engine behind it, and they assign influence where none was required. You didn't rewrite the player. You just existed while someone finally chose to operate at their true speed, and that was enough to make the world assume you controlled the outcome. Number 13. You didn't move the pieces. You revealed the board. Transformation is rarely about being pushed, coached, or manipulated. Most breakthroughs happen quietly, in the spaces no one sees. The early mornings, the sleepless nights, the repeated failures no one talks about. What actually propels someone forward isn't someone else moving the pieces for them. It's seeing the full game clearly. And that is exactly what your presence did. You didn't orchestrate, guide, or control. You revealed the board. You existed in a way that made the invisible structure of possibility undeniable. Suddenly, what was previously hidden, the paths, the consequences, the potential, became obvious. And with that clarity, the player could make the moves themselves. The magic of revealing the board is that it shifts responsibility entirely onto the player. Once they can see the full layout, the gaps in their strategy, the doors they've been ignoring, the mistakes that have cost them, the choice to act becomes unavoidable. You didn't give them instructions. You didn't hand them a roadmap. You simply existed in a space where clarity became unavoidable, and clarity is the most powerful trigger for action. Observers, however, don't see the quiet revelation. They see results. They see someone moving differently, faster and more decisively. They see success materializing in ways that feel sudden and almost unnatural, and they need an explanation. That's when you become the perceived engine of change. Because the board was revealed, the leaps look intentional, as if you controlled each move. People credit you because the transformation is legible. They can connect the dots in a way that makes sense, even if the actual labor of progress was carried entirely by the player. What makes this especially potent is that it requires no effort on your part beyond being present and aligned. You didn't need to intervene, correct, or pressure. The very act of existing in clarity, in a space where choices are visible and obvious, is enough to catalyze change. This is why perception so often exaggerates influence. People see the outcome, they see the clarity you embody, and their brains automatically create the story of orchestration. You didn't move the pieces. You simply revealed the board, and in doing so, allowed the player to claim the transformation themselves, a truth far more profound than any external push could ever achieve. Number 14. The rumor exists because transformation is louder than truth. Truth is quiet. It unfolds in the shadows, in the private struggles no one witnesses. Every late night spent pushing limits, every self-imposed challenge, every moment of resistance against comfort, all of it builds the foundation for transformation. But none of that is visible. What the world sees is the leap, the sudden clarity, the accelerated success. And human brains, desperate for an explanation, automatically invent a story that can be told out loud. That story needs a face, a cause, a why, Because raw effort and internal discipline are invisible and inconvenient to acknowledge. That's why the rumor exists, and why it points to you. Transformation is inherently loud. Results, confidence, presence, and energy scream in ways private effort never can. Observers interpret what they can measure and see, not what they can't. They connect the visible dots, assign cause, and suddenly your name is at the center of a narrative you didn't write. You didn't direct, push, or manipulate. You didn't orchestrate the growth. But when someone's evolution becomes undeniable, and the real process is hidden from view, the human brain chooses a simpler, more digestible story. Someone must be behind this. That someone becomes you. The rumor works because it makes sense in the context of human psychology. People hate chaos and unpredictability. They crave stories with agency and order. Transformation, by its nature, defies easy comprehension. It's the noise that demands attention, while the truth, the slow, private grind, is silent, uncelebrated, and invisible. So the world writes a narrative that can be discussed openly, analyzed, and shared. Your presence fits perfectly into that narrative, whether you had any involvement or not. Ironically, you benefit from the rumor without trying. It elevates your perceived influence, magnifies your presence, and assigns you a power you didn't actively claim. That's the paradox of human perception. The louder the transformation, the more the invisible truth is ignored, and the easier it becomes to credit the nearest, most visible factor: you. Transformation doesn't need a mastermind to be real. It only needs results. And when the results speak, the story spreads, and people assume causation instead of acknowledging the quiet reality. The player did the work, but the world needed someone to blame or someone to credit, and your name fit the role perfectly. Conclusion. What we've uncovered here is more than just a story of transformation. It's a lesson in perception, psychology, and the invisible forces that shape how people interpret success. The truth is brutal, fascinating, and often misunderstood. The player's overhaul didn't happen because of someone else's direction, manipulation, or intervention. It happened because of their own relentless choices, their internal discipline, and their willingness to face uncomfortable truths that no one else could see. And yet, human nature has a way of bending reality to fit convenient narratives. Your presence, your energy, your standards, and the timing of your proximity made you appear as the spark, the catalyst, the engine behind a leap that was already inevitable. That perception, whether fair or accurate, is powerful because human brains are wired to assign agency externally. Every point we've explored, from disruption and mirrored reflection to perceived influence, emotional friction, and the creation of stories, reveals the same subtle truth. Transformation is always louder than the quiet, invisible work that drives it. Observers latch onto the visible, they assign credit or blame, and in the process, the real architects of change often remain hidden. You didn't orchestrate the transformation, but your mere existence in that space magnified its visibility, highlighted possibilities, and made the leap legible to everyone watching. The fascinating paradox is that you gain influence without having moved a single piece. Your presence became the narrative anchor, the before and after marker, the unavoidable contrast against which growth could be measured. This is the power of perception intertwined with reality. It reminds us that human achievement is messy, internal, and largely invisible. Yet the world will always need a story to digest it. You are part of that story, not because you manipulated it, but because transformation requires witnesses, and human minds crave explanation. That is the quiet, understated power you carry, to exist in a way that reveals potential, sets standards, and creates contrast, all without taking a single direct action. If this breakdown opened your eyes, gave you a deeper understanding of influence, or made you see transformation in a way you've never considered before, then don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel for more insights that go beyond the surface. Hit that like button if this resonated. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences, and share this video with anyone who's ready to see the unseen forces shaping growth. The truth is out there, and it's far more powerful than anyone realizes. God bless you.